Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in the South Carolina Lowcountry on a June evening is a physical presence. It's thick, wet, and heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, clinging to the skin like a shroud. On the night of June 7, 2021, on a sprawling 1,000-acre hunting estate known as Moselle, that air was also filled with the metallic tang of gunpowder and the silence that follows sudden shocking violence. It was just after 10 o'clock when a man's voice, frantic and cracking with a manufactured panic, reached a 911 dispatcher. The voice belonged to Richard Alexander Murdaugh, known to everyone as Alex, the scion of the most powerful legal family in this part of the world. He claimed he had just returned home to a scene of unimaginable horror. He told the dispatcher he had been to visit his elderly mother. He said he came back to find his wife, 52-year-old Maggie, and their 22-year-old son, Paul, lying on the ground by the property's dog kennels. He said they were not breathing. When asked if they had been shot, his voice hitched. He said it was bad. It was, in fact, catastrophic. The ensuing investigation would reveal a crime scene of stunning brutality. Paul had been shot twice with a shotgun, the second blast to his head and neck, delivered at such close range, it was instantly decapitating. Maggie had been shot multiple times with a .300 blackout assault rifle as she tried to flee, a final cold-blooded shot delivered to the back of her head as she lay on the ground. The initial shockwave that radiated from Moselle that night was centered on a single, terrifying question. Who would dare to execute the wife and son of a Murdaugh? For 100 years, that name had been synonymous with the law itself in this corner of South Carolina. The Murdaughs were not just lawyers, they were the system. They were solicitors, judges, and kingmakers. An attack on them felt like an attack on the very structure of power in the Lowcountry. But as investigators began to peel back the layers of Alex Murdaugh's life, the horror of the crime scene would soon be matched by the horror of the secrets it was meant to conceal. The bodies at the kennels were not the beginning of a story, but the bloody, desperate end of one. Tonight, we dissect the anatomy of a dynastic downfall, exploring how a century of unchecked influence, a hidden life of staggering financial fraud, and the corrosive weight of secrets finally imploded in a hailstorm of bullets, fired by the one man who had the most to lose. To understand the depth of the Murdaugh family's fall, you must first comprehend the heights from which they tumbled. The story of their power begins in 1910, when Randolph Murdaugh Sr. founded a small law firm in Hampton County, South Carolina. He was a formidable figure, and in 1920 he was elected to the office of solicitor for the 14th Judicial Circuit, a jurisdiction covering 5 counties in the state's rural Lowcountry. He was the chief prosecutor, the most powerful law enforcement officer in the region, and for the next 87 consecutive years, that power would be passed down like a birthright. After Randolph Sr. was killed in a train wreck in 1940, his son Randolph Buster Murdaugh Jr. took his place, and when Buster Jr. retired in 1986, his son Randolph Murdaugh III, Alex's father, was elected to the same position. For nearly a century, if you were charged with a serious crime in the 14th Circuit, you faced a Murdaugh in the courtroom. They held the power of life and death, deciding who to prosecute, what charges to bring, and what plea bargains to offer. Their influence was not confined to the solicitor's office. The family law firm, which eventually became Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Eltzroth, and Detrick, or PMPED, grew into a regional powerhouse, specializing in high-stakes personal injury litigation and winning massive verdicts against corporations and insurance companies. They became fabulously wealthy, not just powerful. The name Murdaugh became a currency. It opened doors, silenced critics, and bent the rules. Law enforcement officers deferred to them. Judges were their friends and colleagues. They cultivated an image of benevolent country lawyers, but beneath it was a deeply entrenched system of patronage and control. They were the law, and in the Lowcountry everyone knew it. Alex Murdaugh was born into this world of immense privilege and expectation. He was not destined to be the solicitor like his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. That path was for his older brother Randy. But Alex was a charismatic, backslapping, good-old-boy litigator who seemed to possess the Midas touch in the courtroom. He joined the family firm and quickly became one of its most successful plaintiffs' attorneys, winning multi-million-dollar settlements that further enriched the family and solidified their legend. He married Maggie, a woman from a well-to-do family, and they had two sons, Richard Jr., known as Buster, and Paul. They lived a life of extraordinary wealth, splitting their time between a historic home in the town of Hampton, a beach house on a Disto island, and the sprawling 1,770-acre hunting lodge and estate they called Moselle. To the outside world, they were the picture of Southern aristocracy, a happy, powerful family living a charmed life. But behind the gates of Moselle, deep fissures were forming in the foundation of the Murdaugh dynasty, cracks that would soon rupture with catastrophic force. The first public tremor that something was deeply wrong in the Murdaugh world came on a cold night in February 2019. It was an event that would act as the catalyst for the entire unraveling, a tragedy born from arrogance and impunity. Late on the night of February 23rd, a group of 6 young people, all under the legal drinking age, left an oyster roast on Pauke Island. They were in a 17-foot motorboat owned by Alex Murdaugh, and at the helm was his 19-year-old son, Paul. By all accounts, Paul was heavily intoxicated, belligerent, and driving the boat recklessly in the dark, foggy conditions of Archer's Creek. His friends pleaded with him to let someone else drive, but he refused. At approximately 2:20 in the morning, the boat slammed into the pilings of the R.C. Berkeley Bridge near Paris Island. The impact threw several of the passengers into the cold, dark water. 5 of them managed to surface, injured and disoriented, but one did not. 19-year-old Mallory Beach was missing. In the chaotic aftermath, Paul Murdaugh's primary concern seemed to be not the fate of his missing friend, but the trouble he was in. Witnesses described him as incooperative and belligerent with first responders, more focused on making calls to his father and grandfather than on aiding the search. The Murdaugh machine immediately clicked into gear. Alex arrived at the hospital where the survivors were being treated, and, according to testimony from one of the young passengers, began a quiet campaign to control the narrative, advising them not to speak to law enforcement. It took search crews 8 days to find Mallory Beach's body. An autopsy confirmed she died from blunt force trauma and drowning. The public outcry was immense. Here was a clear case of a privileged young man whose reckless actions had led to a death, and the community watched closely to see if the Murdaugh name would once again prove to be above the law. For a time, it seemed it might. Despite overwhelming evidence of his intoxication and recklessness, it took the South Carolina Attorney General's office nearly 2 months to charge Paul Murdaugh with 3 felony counts of boating under the influence, including one causing great bodily injury and death. The case moved at a glacial pace, bogged down by procedural delays that many saw as a direct result of the Murdaugh family's influence. But one thing the family could not control was the civil lawsuit filed by the Beach family. It was a wrongful death suit that named not only Paul, but also Alex Murdaugh as a defendant. This lawsuit was the ticking time bomb that threatened to blow the family's secrets wide open. The Beach family's attorneys were determined to get a full accounting of Alex Murdaugh's finances to prove he was culpable in allowing his underage son access to the boat and alcohol. They wanted to know exactly how much the Murdaughs were worth, and Alex Murdaugh knew, with a certainty that must have kept him awake at night, that he could not let that happen, because his finances were a catastrophic house of cards, built on a decade of breathtaking theft and deception. While the Mallory Beach boat crash was the public-facing crisis threatening the Murdaugh empire, 2 other deaths lingered in the shadows, their files gathering dust, their circumstances whispered about in the small towns of the Lowcountry. The first was that of Stephen Smith. In July of 2015, the 19-year-old nursing student was found dead in the middle of a rural road in Hampton County. His body had catastrophic head trauma, and his car was found 3 miles away, out of gas. The initial highway patrol report ruled it a hit-and-run. But the evidence didn't quite fit. There was no glass, no vehicle debris, no skid marks on the road. The county coroner, who had decades of experience, strongly contested the finding, believing the injuries were not consistent with being struck by a car. During the investigation, the Murdaugh name surfaced repeatedly in witness tips and rumors. Stephen Smith had been a high school classmate of Alex's older son, Buster. Whispers of a possible relationship between the two and of a potential violent altercation circulated throughout the community. One investigator's report documented that a tipster had pointed the finger at the Murdaugh family, but the information was dismissed. The case went cold, officially classified as an unsolved hit-and-run, another strange and tragic event in the orbit of a family that seemed to attract them. But Stephen Smith's mother never believed the official story, and she never stopped fighting for answers. 3 years later, in February of 2018, death visited the Murdaugh household directly. Gloria Satterfield had worked for the family for over 2 decades. She was their housekeeper and nanny, a beloved figure who had helped raise Buster and Paul. One morning, she allegedly tripped and fell down the front steps of the Murdaugh's Moselle home. The fall resulted in a severe head injury, and after 3 weeks in the hospital, Gloria Satterfield died. Her death was attributed to a stroke and cardiac arrest resulting from the fall. In a seemingly generous gesture, Alex Murdaugh approached Satterfield's 2 adult sons at her funeral. He told them that the fall was his fault, that his dogs had caused her to trip, and that he was going to sue himself on their behalf through his homeowner's insurance to make sure they were taken care of for the rest of their lives. He guided them to an attorney, Corey Fleming, a man who was one of his oldest friends and a former college roommate. Alex promised to get them a massive settlement, and he did. He successfully negotiated an insurance payout totaling more than $4.3 million. But Gloria Satterfield's sons never saw a penny of it. In a complex scheme involving his friend, Fleming, and a complicit banker, Alex Murdaugh created a fraudulent bank account with a name deceptively similar to a legitimate legal services company. He then had the entirety of the settlement money funneled into this account and used it as his personal piggy bank. It was a breathtaking act of cruelty and betrayal, stealing from the grieving sons of a woman who had been a loyal and trusted part of his family's life for more than 20 years. And it was just one piece of a much larger, more desperate puzzle of fraud he had been constructing for years. Alex Murdaugh wasn't just a successful lawyer. He was a prolific thief. For at least a decade, he had been systematically stealing money from his law firm, PMPED, and from the vulnerable clients he was supposed to be representing. His method was often simple, but effective. He would structure settlements in a way that allowed him to divert fees meant for the firm into his personal accounts. He would convince clients to write checks to him personally, or to his fake, forged bank account, which he passed off as a legitimate financial services company. He was living a life far beyond even his considerable means, funding a lifestyle of private planes, expensive hunting trips, and, as would later be revealed, a severe and long-running addiction to opioids that cost him upwards of $50,000 a week. He was a classic con man, using his charm, his reputation, and his family name to disarm and deceive everyone around him, including his partners at the law firm that bore his name. He was a master of a financial shell game, constantly moving money around, taking out loans to cover his thefts, then stealing more money to pay back the loans. It was a Ponzi scheme of one, and by the spring of 2021, it was on the verge of total collapse. The pressure was mounting from all sides. The boat crash lawsuit was the most immediate threat. The Beach family's lawyers were demanding a hearing on his finances, scheduled for June 10th. A full forensic accounting would have instantly exposed his insolvency and his crimes. He was running out of money, he was running out of time, and he was running out of lies. And then, on the morning of the murders, the walls began to close in from another direction. For weeks, the chief financial officer of PMPED, a sharp and no-nonsense woman named Jean Seckinger, had been chasing Alex down about missing fees from a recent case. She had found evidence that he had improperly received funds that belonged to the firm. That morning, June 7, 2021, she confronted him in his office. He tried to deflect, to charm his way out of it, but she was persistent. She demanded proof of where the money was. Alex promised he would get it to her, but he knew he couldn't. The game was up. He was about to be exposed as a fraud and a thief by his own partners, the men he had grown up with, the firm his great-grandfather had built. He was facing professional ruin, disbarment, public humiliation, and likely a prison sentence. The dynastic legacy he was born to uphold was about to be shattered by his own hand. He left the office that afternoon under a cloud of immense and desperate pressure. A few hours later, his wife and son were dead. The timeline of June 7, 2021, would become the central focus of the murder investigation and the subsequent trial. It was a day that began with a confrontation over stolen money and ended with two bodies lying in pools of blood. Investigators from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, known as SLED, meticulously pieced together the movements of Alex, Maggie, and Paul through cell phone data, GPS records, and witness testimony. Paul had spent much of the day with a friend working on the Moselle property. Maggie was at the family's beach house on Edisto Island. She had no initial plans to go to Moselle that evening. But in the late afternoon, Alex Murdaugh began calling and texting both his wife and his ailing father. He was trying to convince Maggie to come to Moselle. He told her that his father, Randolph III, was in failing health and that she should come with him to visit. Maggie was hesitant. She seemed unsettled by something. In a text to a friend, she mentioned that Alex was up to something and that he seemed fishy. But ultimately, she agreed to meet him at the property. This was a critical point for prosecutors. The murders were not a random crime of opportunity. The killer had lured one of his victims to the scene. Alex arrived at Moselle around 6:40 in the evening. Maggie arrived a couple of hours later, around 8:30. She left her car running and her purse inside, suggesting she didn't intend to stay long. she and Alex ate dinner together. Around 8:44, Paul, who had been at the kennels checking on a friend's dog, took a short video on his phone. It was a Snapchat video of the dog, its tail wagging, and in the background of that video, 3 distinct voices can be heard: Paul's, Maggie's, and, crucially, Alex Murdaugh's. This piece of evidence, discovered much later in the investigation, would become the single most devastating blow to Alex's defense. For months, he would tell everyone, family, friends, and law enforcement, that he had not been down to the kennels that night. The video proved he was lying. The final communications from Maggie and Paul's phones occurred just before 9 o'clock, a flurry of phone calls and texts, and then silence. Phone data showed that at 9:02 p.m., Alex Murdaugh's phone began to show a flurry of activity, steps being taken at a rapid pace, consistent with someone walking quickly. At 9:04, he called Maggie's phone. No answer. He called again at 9:06. Still no answer. He then got into his Chevrolet Suburban and left the property, heading towards his mother's house in the nearby town of Alameda. He arrived there at 9:22 and stayed for about 20 minutes. He then drove back to Moselle, arriving at Tenahone. It was at 10:06 p.m. that he placed his frantic 911 call. The state's timeline was clear and damning. The murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh happened in the short window of time between 8:49, the time of the kennel video, and 9:02, when Alex Murdaugh began his rapid movements and attempts to build an alibi. The initial response to the crime scene was chaotic, a situation complicated and compromised by Alex Murdaugh himself. As the first sheriff's deputies arrived, they found a grieving husband and father, a pillar of their community, in a state of apparent shock. They allowed him to walk through the active crime scene. His clothes were not immediately collected. His hands were not tested for gunshot residue until much later, and even then the results were telling, showing a high concentration of particles. SLED agents who took over the investigation were faced with a scene that was both brutal and perplexing. There was no sign of forced entry onto the heavily gated property. Nothing was stolen. The killers had used 2 different firearms, a 12-gauge shotgun for Paul and a .300 blackout rifle for Maggie. These were not common street weapons. They were the types of guns one would expect to find on a sprawling hunting estate like Moselle. Alex's story from the beginning was that he had taken a nap after dinner and then driven to his mother's house. Returning to find the horrific scene, he immediately began pushing a theory that the killings were revenge for the boat crash, that someone angry about Mallory Beach's death had targeted his family. But his story had holes. His timeline was tight. His demeanor struck some officers as odd. He seemed more concerned with managing the investigation and pushing his own theories than with the raw grief of losing his entire family, and the evidence simply didn't point to an outside intruder. It pointed to a rage-filled, personal execution carried out by someone who knew the victims and the property intimately. The weapons used were consistent with firearms owned by the Murdaugh family, though the specific murder weapons themselves would never be found. As the weeks turned into months, SLED investigators worked tirelessly and quietly to build their case. They were up against a man who knew the legal system inside and out, a man with powerful friends, and a family legacy that could intimidate witnesses and influence institutions. But the digital evidence was irrefutable. The kennel video placed Alex at the scene of the murders minutes before they occurred, directly contradicting his alibi. His cell phone data documented his every move, creating a timeline of lies. His car's GPS confirmed his trips and the speed at which he drove, showing a man in a hurry, a man executing a plan. And then came the financial motive, as his law firm's internal investigation uncovered the breathtaking scope of his thefts. The why of the murders began to crystallize. Prosecutors would later argue that Alex Murdaugh was a man trapped in a storm of his own making. On June 7th, that storm was about to make landfall. The financial investigation by his firm was closing in, and the boat crash lawsuit was about to blow the lid off his entire fraudulent enterprise. He was facing total ruin. The murders, the state contended, were a desperate, monstrous act of misdirection. He hoped that the brutal killing of his wife and son would accomplish two things. First, it would delay the inevitable financial reckoning. The boat crash hearing would be postponed. The firm's investigation would be put on hold out of sympathy for the grieving widower. It would buy him time. Second, and perhaps more cynically, it would make him a figure of immense public pity. No one would suspect a man who had just lost his entire family of being a common thief. It was a gamble, a horrific high-stakes play to change the narrative from Alex the fraud to Alex the victim. Any lingering public sympathy for Alex Murdaugh evaporated completely on September 4, 2021, 3 months after the murders. On that day, another frantic 911 call was placed, this time by Alex himself. He claimed he had been shot in the head in a drive-by, shooting on a rural road while changing a tire. He was airlifted to a hospital with what was described as a superficial head wound. The story was immediately suspicious. A powerful man whose wife and son were murdered just months earlier is now the victim of a random roadside ambush. It seemed too cinematic to be true, and it was. The story fell apart in a matter of days. Under pressure from SLED investigators, Alex Murdaugh confessed that the shooting was a complete fabrication. He admitted that he had arranged for his distant cousin and alleged drug dealer, a man named Curtis Eddie Smith, to shoot him in the head. It was a bizarre suicide-for-hire plot. Alex's stated goal was for his surviving son, Buster, to be able to collect on a $10 million life insurance policy. He claimed he was in the depths of a crippling opioid addiction and believed his family would be better off without him. This event was a turning point. It proved, in the most public and dramatic way possible, that Alex Murdaugh was a pathological liar, a man capable of orchestrating violence and creating elaborate deceptions to manipulate those around him. The man who claimed to be a grieving victim was now an admitted fraudster and a liar who had tried to stage his own murder. The curtain had been pulled back completely. The public saw not a tragic figure, but a desperate manipulative conman. Following this admission, the indictments came down like an avalanche. First for the botched suicide plot and insurance fraud. Then a torrent of charges related to his financial crimes. Dozens of counts of breach of trust, forgery, and money laundering, encompassing millions of dollars stolen from the Satterfield family and numerous other vulnerable clients. The Murdaugh name, once a symbol of power and respect, was now synonymous with crime and corruption. And finally, on July 14, 2022, more than a year after the killings at Moselle, a grand jury indicted Alex Murdaugh on 2 counts of murder for the deaths of his wife, Maggie, and his son, Paul. The trial of Alex Murdaugh, which began in January 2023 in the small town of Walterboro, South Carolina, was one of the most highly anticipated and intensely covered legal battles in recent American history. It was a spectacle that drew media from around the world, all descending on the Lowcountry to witness the final act of a Southern Gothic tragedy. The prosecution, led by the unflappable and methodical Creighton Waters, had a mountain of circumstantial evidence. Their case rested on a simple, powerful theme. motive, means, and opportunity. They argued that Alex was the only person with a credible reason to want his wife and son dead on that specific night. Waters patiently walked the jury through the perfect storm of Alex's life on June 7th. He detailed the impending financial doom, the confrontation with his law firm's CFO that very morning, and the upcoming hearing in the boat crash lawsuit. The murders, Waters argued, were Alex's last-ditch effort to distract and delay, to generate sympathy and throw a smokescreen over a lifetime of lies that was about to be exposed. For the means, the prosecution pointed to the family's arsenal of firearms. While the specific murder weapons were never recovered, prosecutors alleged Alex disposed of them after the killings. They presented evidence that ammunition purchased by the family matched the rare and specific type found at the crime scene. They showed the jury that the Murdaughs owned multiple .300 blackout rifles and 12-gauge shotguns, the same types of weapons used in the attack. But the heart of the prosecution's case was opportunity, and the key to that was the Kennel video. Playing that short clip from Paul's phone for the jury was the trial's pivotal moment. There was no mistaking the voices. For months, Alex had built his entire alibi on the lie that he was never at the Kennels. The video proved he was there, with Maggie and Paul, just minutes before they were killed. This lie, the prosecution argued, was the confession. Why would an innocent man lie so fundamentally about his whereabouts at the moment of the murders? The state bolstered this with a digital avalanche. Cell phone records, GPS data from Alex's car, and forensic analysis of his phone's activity, all of which painted a picture of a man methodically creating a false timeline and trying to cover his tracks. The defense, led by the legendary and bombastic Dick Harpootlian and his partner Jim Griffin, faced an uphill battle. They couldn't dispute the financial crimes. Alex had already confessed to being a liar and a thief. Their strategy was to try and separate the two Alex Murdaughs. They presented him as a flawed man, a drug addict, and a grieving father, but not a monster capable of slaughtering his own family. They argued that the state's case was purely circumstantial, with no direct evidence, no murder weapons, no bloody clothes, no eyewitnesses. They tried to poke holes in the investigation, highlighting the initial chaos at the crime scene and SLED's failure to test for DNA on Maggie's fingernails. Their main thrust was to create reasonable doubt by floating alternative theories. They suggested the possibility of two shooters, given the two different weapons. They relentlessly pushed the idea that the killings were an act of vigilante justice related to the boat crash, suggesting that someone enraged by Mallory Beach's death had sought revenge. They painted a picture of a vast conspiracy, hinting at threats and shadowy figures, but they offered no concrete evidence or alternative suspects. The trial reached its dramatic climax when, in a high-stakes gamble, Alex Murdaugh took the stand in his own defense. For 2 days, he subjected himself to questioning, hoping his Southern charm and practiced courtroom demeanor could win over the jury. He began by admitting to one of the prosecution's central claims. He confessed that he had, in fact, lied to everyone about being at the Kennels. Looking at the jury, he said, "What a tangled web we weave," and then tried to explain away the lie as a product of his opioid-induced paranoia. He claimed his addiction made him distrustful of the police, and that once he had told the lie, he felt he had to stick with it. He wept on the stand as he described finding the bodies of his wife and son, delivering a performance of grief that was either genuine anguish or the work of a master manipulator. But his testimony crumbled under the relentless cross-examination of Creighton Waters. For hours, Waters forced Alex to admit to lie after lie after lie, confronting him with his thefts from disabled clients, from the sons of his dead housekeeper, from his own law partners. Waters repeatedly asked him, "The real Alex Murdaugh is the one who can look a client in the eye and lie to them?" With each admission, Alex's credibility disintegrated. He was exposed not as a paranoid victim, but as a man for whom lying was as natural as breathing. After 6 weeks of testimony from 76 witnesses, the case went to the jury. The world waited, wondering how long it would take to unravel such a complex web of evidence. The answer was astonishing. In less than 3 hours, the jury of 12 men and women from Colton County returned with a verdict. On March 2, 2023, Alex Murdaugh was found guilty on all counts: 2 counts of murder for killing Maggie and Paul, and 2 weapons charges. The next day, Judge Clifton Newman delivered a sentence that reflected the gravity of the crimes. He sentenced Alex Murdaugh to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The once untouchable scion of a legal dynasty would spend the rest of his life in a prison cell. The conviction for murder was not the end of Alex Murdaugh's legal troubles. He still faces nearly 100 additional state and federal charges for his vast financial crimes. The fall of the House of Murdaugh also had a ripple effect, prompting law enforcement to reopen the investigations into the deaths of both Stephen Smith and Gloria Satterfield. The Smith case was officially reclassified as a homicide, and Satterfield's body was slated to be exhumed as part of a new criminal inquiry. The full extent of the damage wrought by one family's unchecked power is still being calculated. In the end, the anatomy of this dynastic downfall is not the story of a single catastrophic event. It is the story of a slow, systemic rot, hidden for decades behind a veneer of power, wealth, and respectability. The Murdaugh name was a shield, one that deflected scrutiny, intimidated opposition, and fostered a culture of impunity. It created an environment where a man like Alex Murdaugh could believe that the rules did not apply to him, that he could lie, cheat, and steal without consequence. He operated as 2 men: the charming, successful lawyer and devoted family man presented to the world, and the desperate, drug-addled fraudster who existed in the shadows. The murders at Moselle were the moment those 2 identities could no longer coexist. They were the violent, inevitable implosion of a life built on a foundation of deceit. It was the desperate act of a man who would rather become a family annihilator than face the public shame of being revealed for what he truly was. The century-old Murdaugh dynasty did not end with a whimper. It ended with the blast of a shotgun and the desperate lies of a fallen king, a man who discovered that the weight of a legacy built on secrets is a crushing and ultimately fatal burden. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.